Hi, this is Mark Arnold, and this is another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast. And today on the show, I have an author, and he's done a lot of other stuff, but his name is Burt Kearns. We're going to be talking about his latest book about Lawrence Tierney, but he's written other books that I actually enjoyed or loved or wish I had, and we'll find out more about that. So, how are you today, Burt?
Very good, man. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Well, I guess let me just ask you, tell me a little bit about yourself. And I don't know what you were trying to get into in your life because you worked on TV shows, you worked on movies, you're writing books. So, what was your goal in life? All of it, right?
Always trying to pay the rent. I started out a kid from the suburbs in Connecticut suburbs. Grew up in the 1960s. You know, my heroes were the Beatles, Jerry Lewis and Soupy Sales. Wanted to grow up and be one of the Beatles, of course, right? Well, no, I couldn't do that. I became a reporter for local newspapers in Connecticut in the late 1970s as a newspaper editor, then moved to New York City, hoping to get a job on the Village Voice. Thank God I didn't get a job on the Village Voice. I wound up getting hired at Channel 5 News, the 10 o'clock news, WNEW TV. And I worked on the assignment desk there, became a producer, news writer, went over and spent 5 years at NBC, at News 4 New York at Rockefeller Center. And then in 1989, I was kidnapped by a group of Australians. These were Rupert Murdoch's people from Sydney, Australia, who ran his newspaper empire, who came over and took over Metro Media News, which was the place I used to work, old Channel 5, and they turned it into Fox. And they said, you got to meet these guys. You'll love these guys. They're crazy. They're great. They do all kinds of crazy things. I said, cool. I met them and they were terrific. They were real newsmen. They were out to do any kind of crazy story that there was. And I was hired on as the first managing editor of a show called A Current Affair. So I was at A Current Affair for a couple of years. We got kicked out of A Current Affair, wound up taking over a show called Hard Copy in Hollywood on the Paramount lot. And I stayed out here. I've been in Los Angeles ever since. Done a lot of work on documentaries, done a lot of work on I won't call them reality shows, nonfiction shows, things like, Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, Joe Rogan Questions Everything. I think that lasted a few episodes. I was a consultant on that and other shows. But yeah, so I've been out here, I've been writing, I've been working. I wrote a book 22 years ago called Tabloid Baby, which was about my experiences in tabloid television working with Murdoch's people. And it was all about the laws we broke and the crazy stories that we broke, et cetera. I went into hiding for about 2 years after that because I found out that the people who spend their careers making other people's lives miserable really don't like it when you write about them. And so I found out who my friends were, got some other jobs through that. And then I wrote my second book 20 years later with my friend Jeff Abraham, who's a big publicist out here, a great guy. And we wrote a book called The Show Won't Go On, about performers who died on stage. Let me stop talking for a second. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess we could stop there and then go into your other books. But
Sure.
Show Won't Go On was the one that I heard. And I think you were on, if I remember correctly, Gilbert Godfrey's Great Colossal Podcast or whatever it's called. And I think that's
Gilbert's
where
podcast, yeah.
Yeah. And I was planning to buy the book anyway, but of course that sold me. And it's like, well, what caused you to do a book like that? Was it mainly because of your previous experience doing tabloid journalism, that you knew about certain situations where various people died in doing their job, basically, of acting?
Well, really, it came about because Jeff had this idea. He'd gone to an Elvis tribute show in Palm Springs at the Trump 29 casino. So you can blame Donald Trump, as Jeff always likes to say. And there was a guy there who he was the famous person who you'd hear him say, Elvis has left the building at the end of an Elvis show. So he got the gig to be that person at the tribute concerts. They had the Elvis impersonator came out, and then this guy came out and said, ladies and gentlemen, Elvis has left the building. Everybody cheered, and he signed autographs out in the lobby. And Jeff met him and said, and he heard people say, you ought to write a book. You ought to write a story about your life. And the guy said, I have time. Don't worry. I'll write it some day. And then he got in his car to drive home to Las Vegas and was killed in an accident on the way back.
Oh.
So Jeff had this in his head going, there's a book out there on people who died on the way to a show. Leonard Skinner, people who died on the way home from a show, Jim Croce, people who died on stage. He stopped over the house one day and he mentioned it. And I said, well, let's start doing research. Why not? I have some time. Let's do it. So we started doing the research. Because I like to do research. Jeff does. We both like to dig into that kind of stuff. We got to over 1,000 cases and said, you know what? Maybe we can narrow it down to just people who died on stage.
Yeah.
Still, there were more than 400, maybe 500 cases of people who died on stage. This goes back to, this goes back hundreds of years, but many were current. So we wrote the book, and then we got a deal to write the book on the top 100. Then they decided, we'll make it 50 or whatever. So and in the end, there were about 150 cases in the book. Mm-hmm. The only problem we had was that people kept dying on stage, and we have to kept calling the publisher. We got to add this. We have to add this guy. There's a comedian named Ian. His name is Ian Cognito, and he's on stage in the UK, and he says, "Imagine if I had a stroke and I woke up and I began speaking Welsh." Mm-hmm. And he puts his head down. He's dead. Wow. And of course, we found the worst thing you can do is die on stage and be a comedian, because everybody thinks it's part of the show. Nobody thinks that it's for real. We found that a lot. So we did that, and we still keep track. We have a website called theshowwon'tgoon.com, and we keep track of people who continue to die on stage. There was someone who died just a week and a half ago in Sacramento, a harmonica player. He was doing his show, put his head down on his chin down, and he went on stage. Is there a chance of a sequel book or anything, because you're finding so many and there's so much maybe left out of the initial book? Well, yeah. So as a matter of fact, we had to really narrow it down, because we had people who died on camera, on movie sets, in television studios. So we do have that sequel, the book of people who died on movie sets and on camera, because we just had too many. We also had to come up with some rules. It was okay, you can collapse on stage, but then you have to go to the hospital. You can die in the hospital, but it has to be related to falling on the stage. You can't die really backstage. We had the great trumpet player Lee Morgan, the jazz trumpeter, was performing at a place called Slug's Saloon in the East Village about 1972. It was very late at night. They were going for the third set or so. His band was on stage waiting for him. They'd started. He walked toward the stage. His common law wife came in the door and shot him in the back and killed him. Missed it by that much. Almost on stage. Excuse me. So he didn't make it. No. Well, the most notorious one I knew before I ever saw the book was probably Dick Shawn, the comedian. It's and everybody thought it was part of the act. So it's I don't know how much time elapsed before they figured it out, but that was a very sad story, because part of it is that Dick Shawn people don't really know Dick Shawn beyond, I guess, the producers. Maybe it's a mad world, but he was this sort of precursor to Andy Kaufman and people like that. He was a far out comedian, and he had this show called The Second Greatest Entertainer in the Whole Wide World, which he'd been playing around. He'd done hundreds of performances of it, and he was adapting it for a show at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. So he was in San Diego at the university down there in the auditorium. And he did what he usually does in a show, which was the stage would be covered with bricks and newspaper, et cetera. And the audience would file in, and it might take 20 minutes and everything. And then the lights would go down, and he would rise up from the newspapers and the rubbish on the stage. He'd been lying there the entire time. Nobody knew it. And he also, during the intermission, would collapse on stage and lay there, or go, I'm going to take a nap, and lay down on the stage. So he told the stage managers, and they told all the grips and everything, should he fall on the stage, it's part of the act. The sad part was his son was the stage manager at the time, and his son was at the back of the theater with the headsets on, communicating with the stagehands. And Dick Shawn was doing his usual improvisation said, okay, let's do this. Let's pretend that there's a nuclear war outside. And the only survivors are the people in this theater. And I am your leader. Face planted onto the stage. Look, that's got a few jokes. People are laughing. And then looking around, it gets a little bit uncomfortable. People are saying, take his wallet. Dick Shawn's son at the back of the theater says, wait a minute. His dad doesn't usually fall like that. And that was a pretty big header. Gets on the microphone. Can you go out and check? The stagehand walks out, checks on him, gets some more laughs, walks off the stage. Nothing happens. And he says, what happened? He goes, well, what did he say? He goes, I don't know. He wasn't breathing. It's like, what? The son runs to the stage. As it turned out, this theater, this university had a teaching hospital right next door. And the place was full of, the audience was full of doctors. So they immediately went up on the stage and tried to save him and couldn't. And while the rescue efforts were going on, audience members were walking up to the side of the stage and saying, can we get a refund? Because he didn't give us an entire show.
Jeez, wow.
Comedy is not funny. Yeah.
Another one I know about, I don't remember if it was in the book. I don't, Vince Guaraldi, that wasn't really on stage. That was after the performance, if I remember.
Yes, it's not on stage.
Yeah. So it didn't make the book. I didn't remember it.
Sorry,
but yeah, it was, I know it was after a performance. So yeah, I'm just trying to think of other ones.
Well, the greatest one that we had is one that people all remember seeing. Everybody remembers seeing it. This was the talk show guest who died on the Dick Cavett show.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Yeah, go ahead.
Jeff is very good friends with the person who runs Dick Cavett's production company, and he said to us, "Look, if you sell this book, I'll let you watch the video. You'll see the video." Because actually, what happened was, we spoke to Dick Cavett, and he said maybe once a month someone comes up to him and says, "I'll never forget seeing that guy die in your show."
Didn't air, no.
Yeah, and he said, "Why were you in the audience? It never aired."
Yeah,
and I think that the reason was that the guest who was being interviewed at the time, what happened? This was, and Dick Cavett said this was something from the gods. Was a longevity expert and a health food nut who had already been on the stage. He was very funny, talking about crazy things like leaving sugar out of your diet, and crazy things like saying raw vegetables are good. In 1971, that was like, well, this guy's a nut. Yeah. And so he was espousing all these health food theories and longevity theories. On the next, after the break, Pete Hamill, the New York Post reporter and writer, came out, and he was talking about some strikes that were going on in New York City at the time. And while he's being interviewed by Cavett, there's a snoring sound from the gentleman who died. As the way the myth goes, Dick Cavett leaned over and said, "Excuse me, doctor, are we boring you?" And that's been written, and that's been said, and that's people remember that. We got to watch the tape, and nothing like that happened at all. Dick Cavett is talking to Pete Hamill. We hear the noise. Both men look unbelievably like something's wrong here. And Dick Cavett immediately gets up, and he looks up, and he's about to say the one thing that would get a laugh, so he couldn't say it, and he catches himself. Is there a doctor in the house? And he didn't say that. He said, is there a doctor? Is there somebody knows? Is there a doctor? They brought the guy over. They had an oxygen tank that wasn't filled, a defibrillator that wasn't plugged in, and the person that he died there on the stage there. But an amazing story.
So everybody says they've seen it. So what did air that night? Did they just air a rerun?
They aired a rerun that night.
Yeah. Okay.
I have to check the book to tell you what the rerun was. But
They
ran a rerun.
Yeah, because I think
Pete Hamill wrote about it in his column, and because while this was going on, he sat back and started taking notes. And so the next day, he wrote very explicitly about what happened in his column. And then, of course, Dick Cavett spoke about it when he came back on the air again a couple of days later. So they were able to. So people, heard it. It became part of pop culture. People believe they saw it.
Yeah, it's funny. So the next book after that is your current one, the Lawrence Tierney one, or did you do another one before that?
No, the current one is Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's real life tough guy.
Okay, so you did. This is your next book after the show won't go on.
Yes,
Or okay,
the Tierney
very
book
good.
is available now, for pre-order. It's coming out in November.
Mhm.
And the
Yeah.
Tierney book was really like it was my pandemic book, really. I
Know
really
what that's
started the
about?
research back in, I guess it was 2020 March, end of March, beginning of April, when all this happened. And suddenly, we have the lockdown and I'm home. And I sat down and really, I had begun the research a bit, but then really got into the research of the story. People say, who's Lawrence Tierney?
Mhm.
A lot of publishers said, who's Lawrence Tierney? People, agents said, who's Lawrence Tierney? Lawrence Tierney was a very handsome, tough guy, Irish actor from Brooklyn, worked in Irish theater, was brought out to Hollywood with a contract with RKO Pictures, came out to Hollywood in 1943. They wasted him on a lot of movies and small roles here and there. He heard that there was a film being made on what was known as Poverty Row, which was the independent, low budget producers, all centered in one little part of Hollywood Boulevard. He walked over and got himself the role as John Dillinger, the gangster John Dillinger. The movie came out. He became a star literally overnight. The movie sold out in Times Square, the theater there. It sold out around the world. It caused a frenzy everywhere. They blamed crime waves on it. They banned the movie. And Lawrence Tierney was suddenly John Dillinger. About 2 weeks after the movie came out, didn't make the papers. He was arrested for being drunk. About a week later, he was arrested again. 2 weeks later, he was arrested again for being drunk and fighting. Lawrence Tierney, as I say, his career lasted more than 50 years.
Mhm.
He made more than 60 films, appeared on more than 30 television series, and was arrested more than 70 times. The guy basically ruined his career by about 1953, couldn't get any work, got some work here and there, kept making comebacks.
Yep.
He went to Europe and through most of the 60s and worked in Europe and European films. And then by the 1970s, he was a construction worker and he was driving a hansom cab in Central Park. By about 1977, he started coming back, making movies again. They always wanted to hire him, but by now he was no longer the handsome, dashing guy. He was a guy who's his looks were ruined by alcoholism. He was bald. He was stocky. He had a gravelly voice, and he did a scene in the movie Arthur with Dudley Moore and Liza Minnelli. It was the big scene where Arthur, who's the drunk, not Lawrence Tierney this time, is trying to propose to Liza Minnelli. She's the waitress at the diner, and Lawrence Tierney is the guy next to him, keeps interrupting, saying, "Where's my roll? I ordered a roll." And they both run, "Shut up! You eat your roll." Got some laughs from that. And he rebuilt his career, this unbelievable, second career that he had in Hollywood. He was in Prizzi's Honor. He appeared on every television show from Star Trek, Deep Space Nine to Seinfeld, which is an interesting story unto itself, what happened to that Seinfeld. Hunter, Remington Steele. He had a role in Hill Street Blues and wound up, he did the last scene, had the last words in the final season, in the final episode of Hill Street Blues. But of course, everybody knows him from Reservoir Dogs. Everybody believes that Tarantino rediscovered him in Reservoir Dogs. That's really where he, had his peak in his second act. So that was my pandemic job, really, just studying that. It happened actually when I was originally doing research with Jeff on The Show Won't Go On. I found a little article and it said Lawrence Tierney arrested for the 13th time. And this was from like 1950. And I was like, for the 13th time? What? And I looked at it and so, wow. And I said, wait a minute. I drank with this guy one night. I met him once back in about 1992 at a place called the Formosa. It's one of these old Hollywood cafes on Santa Monica Boulevard. And it was after Reservoir Dogs. And I remember he shook my hand. "How you doing? I'm Larry." We drank. He was no fights. He was very, very polite, very, very well behaved. And so I got into the story and found out that it's an incredible story of, it's very tragic because he was a very great actor. It's a story of how alcoholism and mental illness was treated from the 1940s on through the 1990s, how that changed, and how Hollywood treated it, how the gossip columnists found him to be very entertaining, and and in some points they kind of egged him on, and and how people said, this guy, he thinks he's Dillinger. That's his problem. He thinks that he's the character Dillinger, and if only he was strong and not so weak, he could stop drinking. And then he'd go to court for beating up policemen, and he'd be standing there in court and he'd be bloodied, and the judge would say, Mr. Tierney, I could be sending you away for several years, but do you promise not to ever drink again? Yes, Your Honor, I'll never drink again. Okay, $25 fine. And this has happened over and over again.
Now, you actually met him,
yeah.
You said. Did he have some sort of charisma that kind of allowed for him to just be a repeat offender and kind of get off basically almost scot-free? I mean,
yes. Yes. First of all, he was, very handsome guy, very rugged, handsome man, and he could recite poetry. He could speak different languages. While he was being arrested, he was romancing, for instance, people like Gloria Vanderbilt, Shelley Winters, Betsy von Furstenberg, women that went to school with Jacqueline Bouvier. Women loved him. He was a real charmer. But he had a mental illness, and basically, whether it was some sort of, bipolar condition, and of course, alcoholism, he hurt a lot of people. But at the same time, which made the book very interesting, which you kind of are able to kind of cut it in half here, is that when he came to Hollywood, when he returned to Hollywood in the mid 80s, he was hanging out in the same bars that he hung out in back in the 40s. These old dive bars off Hollywood Boulevard that were now filled with youngsters and hipsters, like, hey, let's go to Bordner's and hang on. And wait a minute, look, that's Lawrence Tierney. And Tierney befriended all these young guys who were, they were just out of film school. They wanted to be directors. They wanted to be writers. Mm-hmm. And they wound up becoming directors and writers. Tarantino was one of them. He was friends with these guys that Tierney had befriended and actually like moved in with, and because he'd be the guest that came and never left. And so these people now, they're in their 50s or 60s, and they're telling, they tell stories. Oh, you won't believe what Larry did, because they were the young guys and he was the old guy. Two of the guys who did it were Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski. They are the guys who wrote the movie Big Eyes. And I mentioned that Margaret Keane died today. They wrote the movie about her. They wrote Ed Wood. They produced the O.J. Simpson series that ran on FX. The people who was O.J. Simpson.
I like that one too. Yeah.
When they did Problem Child, they wrote Problem Child with Gilbert Godfrey. But when they were starting out, they would go. They would spend their afternoons in Larry Karaszewski's apartment writing. Yeah. Who lived next door but Lawrence Tierney? And they said, he said he was like a living cartoon character. He was like Kramer from Seinfeld, because he would just burst in without knocking on the door. Okay, guys, let's party, whatever. And they loved him. They said he was, very intelligent, very, very funny. But if you said the wrong thing, he'd suddenly look at you like they thought he was going to kill them because he just had that hair trigger. But very, very interesting character, and people still talk about him today.
Mm-hmm. Now, he seemed to keep getting hired for acting gigs over the years. So was he a reliable actor despite his drinking and his mental illness, or? He always claimed that no, he never drank on set, never drank when he was working. The big films were early in his career. He wound up, after about five or 6 years on some low budget things. Some of them, became masterpieces. It became looked at as masterpieces, but they were low budget things. He got to the point where by about 1955, he was on a very low budget film called, it was called like Panic. And a girl who worked at the popcorn stand at a theater on Wilshire Boulevard was the blonde in it. And he played a cop. And this is kind of funny. There's a murder that takes place across from a bar. He plays a cop who was so drunk he can't remember if he killed her or not. And so I was like, oh, that sounds like Larry.
it turns out that the girl who was dishing out the popcorn was Jane Mansfield.
Hmm.
And she, while they couldn't sell this film, she went on Broadway and was in the Broadway show Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter. And she became a star on Broadway and was about to make her big film debut in Hollywood with The Girl Can't Help It, with Tom Ewell. But these guys said, we got this movie, we have our first movie. And they rush released this movie with Lawrence Tierney and Jane Mansfield before the other one came out. And so things like that. So he was able to work. When he couldn't work, he went to Europe, did a lot of voiceover work there, appeared in some films. And then when he was older, people were like, that's young directors would be like, that's Lawrence Tierney. I want him in my movie. You know, give him a little, let him play the bartender. Let him play, let him play this. I mean, that's what happened with Tarantino. Tarantino, when he wrote the Reservoir Dogs script, dedicated it to like 8 people who, from Kurosawa to people that influenced him in his life, and Lawrence Tierney. And he showed it to his friend Courtney Joyner, who was a screenwriter. And Courtney said, "Oh, you dedicated this to Lawrence Tierney." And he said, "Yeah, Lawrence Tierney, what a guy! He died. He got shot to death in a whorehouse in Mexico." And Courtney said, "No, he lives behind a library. I see him every week." He said, "What?" And that's how Tarantino wound up meeting Lawrence Tierney.
Wow.
And drove him crazy.
Now, what caused you? I mean, you told me you saw that news article and stuff, but what caused you to want to write a book about him? I mean, just that, or?
Well, first of all, no one had ever written a book about him.
Well, that's true.
I said, "Wait, this is great. I love this story." There were little things like Lawrence Tierney, when he worked at RKO, to enter the RKO studios, he had to walk through the door at 780 North Gower Street. That was the door I walked in every day when I worked at Hard Copy on the Paramount lot. That old building was still there. I was like, "Oh wow, I got a little something happening here." But the best part was just that it was great fun researching. What I did was, and I did this very differently than I would usually research a book, I just started collecting every article from every website, from every magazine I could find about Lawrence Tierney on a week by week, month by month basis, starting from when he was born until when stories started popping up in the early 1940s. And I transcribed them. And I spent months just finding stories, transcribing them, putting them in this file. Got up to about 500 single spaced pages of just articles of Lawrence Tierney. And then I started reading it like cold. Oh, great. Oh, he's made it to Hollywood. Oh, wow. He's in Dillinger. Oh, it's a hit. Oh boy. Oh, look what he did now. Oh no. Oh gee. Oh, ouch. And then wait, oh, another movie happening. And I was kind of reading it in real time saying, what's he gonna do now? Oh, what's he, and of course I found that it was like always one step forward, 2 steps backwards. He,
Wow.
He's at his lowest point, and Cecil B. DeMille takes a liking to him and puts him in the movie The Greatest Show on Earth. And he plays the bad guy in The Greatest Show on Earth, the mobster who's kind of running the cheats on the Midway. And Cecil B. DeMille says to him, Paramount loves you. Cecil B. DeMille got a huge kick out of him. He had a trouble shooting a scene where they had to get 8 of the stars, all James Stewart and Charlton Heston, and everybody into this one shot. And Tierney said, "Excuse me, let me show you what you should do," and told Cecil B. DeMille what to do. And he did it. And he loved Lawrence Tierney and said, "You're going to get a multi-year contract at Paramount now. I love working with you so much." And then it hit the fan. He got arrested again, and he beat somebody up, and that went out the window. And it was like that his entire career, his entire life.
Wow.
And no one felt sorry for him. That was the thing. There was no pity for this guy,
right?
By the columnists, but they kept hiring him because he was a good actor.
I mean, it's amazing on 2 different levels. It's amazing that he kept getting hired, and it was also amazing that he kept getting in trouble. So it's like,
he just couldn't help himself. There was a time when he was living on the streets of New York. He was living in abandoned buildings. There are all kind of myths that went on that he had killed a woman in Europe and spent 6 years in a Spanish prison. I spoke to the person that he told the story to, and he said, I spent 4 years in a Spanish prison, then I got out and I escaped and went over to Portugal, etc. And I said, I don't know how to tell you this, but like I've been doing this research on Lawrence Tierney, and there really isn't like more than like a 2-month period where he was off the map. I mean, I could like trace his whereabouts, on a weekly basis.
Yeah.
So no, and if he spent 6 years in a Spanish prison, can you imagine the publicity that would make over here?
Yeah.
Even as washed up as he was. So that story didn't pan out, unfortunately.
Of course, yeah, but I
Enough
mean,
trouble.
so what was your source, like newspapers.com, to get all these different articles and everything, mainly, or?
Newspaper.com helps a lot.
Yeah.
There's places where I was able to get what do you call them, fan magazines,
Yeah.
and other resources, archives of individual newspapers, just what's ever out there. And then you have to you have to kind of dig in, because everybody tells a different story. You get the AP version, and you get the UPI version at the time, then you get a version from the Los Angeles paper, and then you talk to somebody that was there. One of the best interviews, one of my favorite interviews was, I believe it was 1958. Lawrence Tierney, of course, somebody's having a party in Hollywood, and shortly after midnight, boom, 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 there's a bang on the door. Before they can answer it, the door's kicked in, and there's Lawrence Tierney. He's drunk out of his mind, and he's looking for a girl named Mary. And so as the story went, Lawrence Tierney, as the way the papers played it, he knocked on the door, came in. A woman was there with a gentleman friend. He punched the gentleman friend in the face, tore down the curtains, ran out, and then was arrested. Well, I found the guy that he punched. He's 92 years old. He's a British songwriter named Carol Coates, and he had written a couple of songs on Sinatra's "Come Fly With Me" album. And he's up in Carmel, California now, and he's very successful songwriter. And I found him, and because I said, I saw the age of the person that he punched, and I tried to figure it out. So I said, tell me what happened. What happened here? And he said, well, I go, were you alone with this woman? And he came in, he goes, no, it was a party. It was a party, and we're standing there, and all of a sudden the door bursts open, and this guy comes in, and he's a little sweaty, and he's looking around, and he looks at me, and he goes, "You goddamn limey," punched me in the face. And I go, what? And I've seen pictures of this gentleman. He's not a big guy. He's a little songwriter. He's an artist. And I said, well, did you punch him back? He said, well, no. He knocked out my tooth. I was on the floor trying to find my tooth. And so, the sad part was, he said, I was just getting started in Hollywood at the time. I had a song in a movie called Blue Denim that had just come out. And I was going to a lot of Hollywood parties, to promote myself. I had to go to a lot of parties. And he said, for the next year, I was totally frightened that he'd show up at one of these parties and recognize me and hit me again. And, and he goes, I had to get a fake tooth, et cetera. But he never forgot it. There were victims there.
Wow. Yeah. Now Lawrence never got married, but didn't he father 3 children or something like that? Is that right?
Lawrence had a daughter. There's a very interesting part of the book. I was able to speak and got some good help with members of Lawrence Tierney's family. Not to give away too much of the book, but he had a daughter who wound up being raised by his brother and his wife as their daughter. So as his nephew said, it was sort of a Chinatown situation there. My sister's my niece, my uncle's my father's my uncle, etc. And he didn't have much of a relationship with her. He did in once she grew up, and in his later years, he had a sort of a very friendly relationship with her, not any kind of loving daddy relationship, but yeah, his family took a lot of the brunt of his illness and his rages. The family was estranged from him for a long time. He had 2 brothers who came out to Hollywood and became actors. One of them became a very successful, famous actor named Scott Brady. Brady was in movies like he was in a lot of movies with Joan Crawford, did a lot of westerns. He had his own TV show called Shotgun Slade. He changed his name to Scott Brady because at the time his agents basically said, you don't want your name to be Tierney as you're starting here. You don't want people to know that you're related to Lawrence Tierney. But he did, but when people did ask him, he always stuck up for him and said, my brother's the one who got me my start in this. My brother's the one who, if my brother wasn't here, I would have never been able to make it in Hollywood. And he's a good brother. They had a fight. They were estranged for about 20 or 30 years.
And everybody you contacted, for the most part, was willing to talk to you and give stories and everything like that? Or did you get any pushback? Or...
Yes, I got to tell you, Lawrence Tierney has been dead for 20 years.
Right.
I think he died in I think 2001, 2002. A lot of these things happened 30 years ago, and people like Quentin Tarantino are still traumatized by their experiences with Lawrence Tierney. Jerry Seinfeld is still traumatized by his experiences with Lawrence Tierney. Didn't want to talk. I spoke to Michael Madsen, who was in the cast of Reservoir Dogs, and people who were with Tierney when he did Seinfeld. I mentioned Seinfeld. There's an episode called The Jacket. Seinfeld. It was where Tierney played Elaine's father, a former military man and author named Alton Bennis. And the whole idea was that he had to go out and have dinner with Jerry and Jason Alexander, and he scared the hell out of both of them. He was a very scary character, and he was very funny, he played it very down the middle and very deadpan, and was hilarious.
Yeah,
and they loved him, and they said, we're going to bring this guy back. We're going to make him a recurring character. He's going to play Elaine's father. Almost. They're on the set. They're on the apartment set, and they're rehearsing a scene, and they're all talking about the next scene. They look over and they see Tierney over by the kitchen area take a butcher knife out of the butcher block on the counter, stick it in his coat. And Julie Louis-Dreyfus says, "Do you see that?" And the director goes, do you see that? And they're like, I just stole the butcher knife. And they're like, "Well, I'm not going to say anything." And Larry David said, "I'm not saying anything." Jerry Seinfeld walks over to him. "Hey, Larry, what's with the knife?" And Tierney's caught, blushes, turns red, and says, just thought I'd have it in case I have to stab you. And did the psycho thing over Jerry's head in front of everyone. And they all said, "Get him out of here. Do not invite him back." And that's how he lost out on his recurring part in Seinfeld. Wow. He thought he was being funny.
Yeah.
And he did not get the humor of Seinfeld. He's like, "I've worked with Jack Benny, I've worked with some of the greats. This isn't funny. What? I don't get he didn't get the Seinfeld humor at all."
Wow.
How did this guy get a show?
Show about nothing. There you go. Before I go on to your Shemp book, I want to ask about some of the different TV shows you worked on. You mentioned a couple of them.
Sure.
How did you get involved with some of these people? I mean, it's like, you can give me the full titles again, but I mean, we mentioned them kind of at the top, like Joe Rogan, Jesse Ventura, Gene Simmons. I mean, these are all kind of like extreme personalities. It seems like, wow, do you get attracted to that, or they get attracted to you, or?
Well, let's see. I came out of news, then went over to, the tabloid television, which was reality, not news, but it was still like reality stuff. So a lot of the TV I did was like documentary television. I worked for Court TV, did a lot of things for Court TV. Worked for a show called Mugshots, where we do a story on the Green River Killer, John Gotti, things like that, where you take the mugshot of someone who has been arrested. Let's say it was P. Diddy, and then you would do the whole story of what was behind that mugshot, what led up to his crimes, etc. These are 1-hour documentary shows on Court TV. Wound up selling a couple of series. I had my own production company with a guy named Brett Hudson. Brett was a member of the Hudson Brothers back in the 70s. I remember the Hudson Brothers television show and the pop group. Brett and I were partners for about 10 years, and we did a lot of television series and specials together. We sold a show called The Secret History of Rock and Roll to Court TV. And it was basically, the crimes of rock and roll, how Guns N' Roses kicked out their drummer by making him sign a contract, that was able to throw him out of the band because, amid all those drugs, he did too many drugs. He did more drugs than Axl Rose, apparently. So they got rid of him. What Phil Spector did to Ronnie Spector, et cetera. And so you're looking for a host for the show, and the network, and you go to the agencies, and they say, well, these are guys that would be willing to host the show. The names that you wouldn't expect that are going to host, and Gene Simmons was one of them. I'm like, yeah, let's use Gene Simmons. And this was before Gene really came back and did shows like the reality show he did with his family, and he did a thing at a girls' school or something. So Gene was just getting started, and he comes up, and the first thing he says is, why do men die before their wives? Because they want to. It's like, this guy's like a Borscht Belt comic. And that's all he was doing all the time. And then he would say the most incredibly sexist things, and marriage and all this and that. And I say, Gene, I always thought that Kiss was started by Peter Criss because that's what he called the drummer. No way. They had nothing. It was me and Paul Stanley all the way. These other two guys say, would you like fries with that order? He was just, it was all comedy. And so I said, we got to do a show with Gene Simmons. So we went out and pitched a show called Sex with Gene Simmons. And it was going to be a talk show, sort of like Playboy After Dark with Hugh Hefner. And Gene Simmons would be the host, and he would be able to interview people and talk and this and that. And we got an incredible response. Our agent brought it out, got incredible response from all these networks. Well, as it turned out, these guys, again, this was about the year around 2000. They had no intention of doing a talk show or a show with Gene Simmons, but they all wanted to meet him. And so we'd show up at the USA Network. We'd be here with like Doug Herzog, the head of USA, and the hallways were filled with people that worked there holding albums and Gene Simmons dolls. They wanted autographed, and you get in there and they say, Gene, did you really have sex with 2,000 women? Oh yes, let me tell you. And he would just tell these stories, and they go, oh, Gene, here's my cell phone. Please, you gotta leave a message for my friend. And I'm sitting there, Brett and I are sitting there going, they're not going to sell. They don't want the show. They just want to meet Gene Simmons. And so we never sold that show. Wow. But by doing that, I mean, we did a series for the old Bravo network called All the President's Movies, and it was a history of the White House screening room. Somebody had brought us the White House projectionist from Truman through Reagan. He's the guy who was the projectionist for every movie that was shown in the White House, and he kept notes of every screening and who was in every screening. Huh. So we were able to find out what was Nixon and Kissinger watching the night they invaded Cambodia. Who were the mystery women that JFK was watching Espresso Bongo with while Jackie was in Paris, that sort of thing. So we had an incredible show, and that one we talked to everybody from Robert Duvall to James Earl Jones to Cliff Robertson, and the host for that was Martin Sheen, who at the time I think was playing the president on the West Wing. Yeah. And so he was our narrator for that. So because you go to the agencies, Martin Sheen would love to host something like that. So we're able to work with them, an interesting amount of characters, which led to Jesse Ventura and Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura. There came a time in television where the idea was to do a TV show with a celebrity about what their passion was. What's your passion? And so they brought me in to do a show with Tommy Lee from Motley Crue. And Tommy Lee's passion were strange cults, because his father was a member of the Masons. And there was one line in his book where it said, it may have been one of the chapters that was narrated by his penis. I guess that was his book that he had, where it was alternating chapters. And it said, my dad was a Mason, and he'd come home and I'd ask him what he did, and he would never tell me. It was a mystery. So they were like, that's it. Tommy Lee's going to chase down cults around the world. And they brought me in to be the producer of it. And I met with Tommy Lee and his agent. There was his manager at the time. And I was like, so Tommy, how are you doing? And he's like, oh, I'm fine. He was like, it's like a 12-year-old. It's like, wow. Are you, he was just like a kid. And I'm like, so you're really into this? And this is all about you. He goes, I guess so. I guess. And his manager's like, yes, and I should be on the show with him because Tommy's in it. All right, we get it. But I ended up not doing that show, but wound up brought in to help reviving it on the air, the show Conspiracy Theory with Jesse Ventura, because Jesse Ventura was into conspiracies. He was always the thing that got him going was the Kennedy assassination. He was just obsessed with the Kennedy assassination. And again, Jesse really went out there, and Jesse was quite a character. I mean, he was a politician. the one thing about Jesse was that he'd be able to stay on point. He would do an interview on something, and earlier that day Jesse would say, I believe there should be a separation of church and state. Churches should be taxed. They should give taxes on churches. And then he would go on Larry King that night, and Larry say, "Oh, so Jesse, what do you think about marijuana?" And he'd say, "I think churches should be taxed." And Jesse would just stick to whatever he was talking about. But he also would never do anything that he didn't believe. Wouldn't read anything he didn't believe. Wouldn't say anything on camera that he didn't believe, which was frustrating sometimes.
Yeah.
When he had an outfit that he would wear. It would be a black T-shirt, a black leather coat, and it'd be Jesse Ventura. And he was forced to do an interview that he didn't want to do on a story he didn't believe, so he wore a pink checked jacket instead, and a yellow T-shirt to prove that he didn't want to be there. But a great guy. Jesse was very fun to work with.
Interesting.
I think we did three seasons of that show.
It's just extreme personalities. That's how I kind of see them all.
Yeah.
So but I guess that's what makes a good celebrity. I mean, it's like they are memorable for at least themselves, if not for what they've done. So
Yeah, and that's also what makes a good television personality, are the ones who really can pop on camera. The thing with Jesse is he'd turn it on when you needed him to turn it on. In an interview, he'd get tough, or he'd be tough on camera. The same people that brought Jesse Ventura to the network were the people who discovered John Taffer, the guy who does Bar Rescue. And I've never seen that show. That guy Taffer just screams and throws things and yells, and he really brings it on camera. And that's sort of that's what you're always looking for, somebody that really pops. And Jesse did. I think now he's doing I was with him when he didn't want to have to go through the TSA checkpoint at airports. Basically, because I think he had two hips and would always go off, the alarm would go off. And he said, I was governor, and it said that I am the Honorable Jesse Ventura. So if I'm honorable, why do I have to go through this metal detector? I'm not going through it. And he refused to fly commercial. Now he refused, and he made a public statement about this, made a public stand in between the second and third season of the television show. So we find out as we're preparing, oh, by the way, Jesse's not flying commercial. It's like, what? Well, we have to go all over the country to shoot this show. What do you mean he's not going to fly commercial? And he's like, well, he won't do it. We're not going to get a private plane, so we'll get him a bus. How's that, or an RV? So, okay. So the first thing he had to do was go from Minnesota to Chicago, and then he's going to take a train to get to New York, et cetera. And so we had a special, bus to pick him up. We get there. It was a Saturday morning. I get a call at about 5 o'clock in the morning. He's in Minnesota. He's refusing to get on the bus. Why? Because they sent a stripper bus, with the pink flashing lights and a disco ball and a pole. They sent a party. They got a party bus. They didn't get like a regular sort of camper. And so Jesse would have to go from Minneapolis to Chicago in this stripper bus. But he liked the driver. He was salt of the earth. He liked the guy who was driving. He said, forget, I'll do it. So he went to Chicago with that bus. Then later he was able to use his own camper and his own thing, and he drove around in that. So that was better.
And one thing, I hope you did this, because I read a little bit about your biography and everything, and looked on your website and everything. It's like, I'm a huge Monty Python fan, and I didn't know you did a documentary on Neil Innes called The Seventh Python. How did that one come about? Now I have to go see it, because I thought I've seen everything Monty Python related, but anyway, go ahead.
The Seventh Python. I grew up, I was a great fan of Monty Python. The time when it first came over here in America, I was probably, in high school, going into college, Monty Python was everything. When they had broken up, got back together. I remember they had the Holy Grail came on. They came to New York, and they did, they showed up and they did tours, etc. I was totally into Monty Python. And then Neil Innes, of course, who did music and did bits for Monty Python, also did the Ruddles. Yes. It was the parody group of the Beatles. Lorne Michaels produced a 1-hour special on NBC. George Harrison was in it. Belushi was in it. The Monty Python people were in it. and I believe it was the lowest rated show of the week.
Yeah.
When it aired. But the Ruddles, the album came out, and I was one of the people who felt that the Ruddles songs were just as good as the Beatles songs. Piggy in the Middle, and I thought they were terrific. So anyway, I talked about the show Mugshots. I'm working for Court TV. The producer of Mugshots is doing a documentary on the life and death of John Lennon. So I was out to produce the life and death of John Lennon. I went to England, and I traced his life in England to all the major spots, from where he was born in Liverpool to Strawberry Fields, to Abbey Road Studios, to the apartment that he lived in, etc. And then when all that was done, I had to go to New York and trace his last days in New York, where I interviewed the surgeon who massaged his heart, after he was shot. But anyway, as we're interviewing people, we interviewed people that were friends with Lennon when he was a kid. The DJ that did one of his last interviews. We interviewed the sound engineer for the White Album, and I said, I got to get the guy who played the Lennon character in the Ruddles. Neil Innes played Ron Nasty.
Yeah.
So I've got to interview him. So we went over and we interviewed Neil Innes. He was very suspicious. Don't trust journalists too much in that. But was very nice, et cetera. And the last thing we said was, what did you learn from John Lennon in the end, et cetera. And he said, he told what Lennon had taught him. He had met Lennon here and there, and he was one of George Harrison's best friends. Neil Innes was, and he said John Lennon taught me never trust a journalist. So I put that. We put that quote in the documentary. And he loved it. So just move forward a bit. The way I got in touch with him was there was a Neil Innes website back in the early 2000s. It was it had all of his lyrics, all of his videos. It was a world, and this was while the internet was still kind of coming into play and getting into shape. And these two women from Los Angeles who were ultra Monty Python Neil Innes fans that started this. And Neil didn't know about it. They didn't tell him about it. He found out about it, and he began to talk with them and correspond, et cetera. And he was coming to Los Angeles in 2003, I believe, and they said, we're going to book some shows for you with a band made up of your fans who are out here. So Neil came over, and I got in touch with him. I said, this is great. I was our company with Brett. We were shooting a couple of television series, and we had camera crews, and we said, let's shoot a documentary on you. And Neil, because I had put in the line, don't trust journalists, he loved that, and he agreed to do it. And so we shot the shows in Hollywood. He did a show with the band, and then he did another solo show where Eric Idle came on, and he did some things with Eric Idle. We followed him to a radio interview at a Breakfast with the Beatles show, did long interviews with him, took him places, et cetera. Shot some kind of Python-esque material with him, and then ran out of money and put all the tapes in a box for 5 years. Because it was a documentary. We couldn't get it done, et cetera. We raised the money 5 years later, did some more interviews. I mean, originally, for instance, to show how well liked and loved Neil Innes was. Neil Innes, by the way, was one of the sweetest, nicest guys in show business. The other nicest guy is Michael Palin from Monty Python. And Michael Palin happened to be promoting one of his books. And we got in touch with them, and they said, I saw they was doing a signing in Beverly Hills, and called him and called his people and said, can you do an interview with us about Neil Innes? And they're like, well, no, he's on a book tour. He can't do it. He called and said, all right, look, where are you? I'll come down and do it in the morning. And he did it. And so we had an interview with him. We interviewed John Cleese. We interviewed Idle. We interviewed everybody in Python except for Terry Gilliam, who we crossed. There were cross signals there, and we missed him. Terry Jones. We went to Terry Jones's house and spoke with him. But anyway, we did a nice piece on Neil. Finally got it together. Showed it at a bunch of Beatle fan fests in Chicago and in New Jersey, and I think in Las Vegas. And so it started circulating among the Beatle fans. We entered in a few film festivals. Neil entered it in film festival in Britain. It won a film festival in Perth, Australia, et cetera. And we got a distribution deal to distribute the film.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, all we have to do now is clear the music. What happened was, when the Ruddles album came out, the Beatles lawyers sued Neil Innes for copyright infringement, for plagiarism. It was parody, et cetera. But they gave in, and every Ruddles song is credited to Neil Innes, Paul McCartney, and John Lennon.
Yeah.
And we couldn't afford the music, so it sat. It just the film has sat out there now since about 2008.
So
somebody put it on YouTube. We didn't know, but it's on YouTube. And I think it was somebody who had something to do with one of the either film festivals or Beatle fests, who made a copy or kept the DVD and put it on YouTube.
So it's not officially released then. Is that what you're saying?
It never was officially released. No, it was it was shown. It made the
Okay,
film
so that's why I
festival.
haven't seen it.
Yeah.
When was it supposed to come in? Let's assume you got all the clearances. When would it have supposed to have come out then?
It would have been out by 2010.
Okay.
I would think, by the way it was going. I mean, we it was one of these things we did kind of like the the road show tour, where we did a theater in outside Chicago, where Tim Kazurinsky, the ex-Saturday Night Live performer, hosted and interviewed Neil. Neil performed. We showed the film, did that sort of thing. We did that at the in Hollywood at the Egyptian Theater as well. Neil performed. We showed the film. It was part of a rock and roll film festival that was there. So yeah, so it did the festival circuit and then sat there and maybe said and then Neil passed away a couple of years ago, which was sad. He was just dropped. He just just dropped dead, as they say. Not on stage. Nobody's perfect.
Out of all the people we've talked about, he is one person I actually saw and met about 10 years ago. He performed in San Francisco when I was still living down there. And I didn't know about your documentary. I might have asked about it, but I did ask about Rutland Weekend Television. I asked about Magical Mystery Tour and just a few other things, and just give his thoughts. I really did want Rutland Weekend Television come out, and he said the same thing. Basically, it's music rights that's all tied up, and but I did manage to get all the episodes anyway, because they all ended up on YouTube at some point, and I downloaded them before they took them off. So
right, exactly, yeah.
I do have them.
You have to do it.
But they're kind of uneven, but I mean, it had one episode that has George Harrison on it. That's where the Ruddles first appeared and all sorts of things. So it's worth seeing for that.
And that was another thing with Neil. Part of the theme of the movie was Neil's real hatred of fame. He never wanted to be famous, and he was always on alongside of it. I mean, he's in the Bonzos, and the Bonzo Doodah Dog Band, and he's in Magical Mystery Tour. Right. He makes the Bonzos make their first single, and Paul McCartney produces it.
Right.
And they refuse to let Paul McCartney put his name on the single. Or we're going to call you Apollo C. Vermouth. You're not going to. Nobody can know this. And he works with George Harrison, and he directed a couple of videos for George Harrison when George Harrison made his comeback toward the end, and he was always right alongside very famous people. He was sort of like the most famous person you've never heard of. One thing we did in the documentary also was I went on Hollywood Boulevard and went to Windsor Castle and in London and showed his pictures. Do you know who this guy is? And got some very funny responses of who they thought the guy could possibly be.
Wow. No, I've known about him probably since Holy Grail. That's probably the first, that I saw him. And then probably was the Saturday Night Live episode that had the Ruddles on it, and then he actually performed with Eric Idle on a later Saturday Night Live. So slowly over time I go, oh, this is a guy to be reckoned with. He's not part of the Pythons, but he's around. And same thing with the Beatles. And it is kind of always weird. I don't know if he purposely did that or just was bad luck that he never got successful and is around all these successful people.
He deliberately had an aversion to
his career. Okay,
that was the thing, and he talked to his wife, and it was sort of, she'd always stuck with him, through all these years. I think he was married for 50 years, wonderful, wonderful woman. And she would be like, yeah, he said that's one reason why George Harrison liked him so much, because
Mhm.
he wasn't somebody who would look at him and go, oh, it's George Harrison. It's just like, oh, it's just another bloke.
Mhm.
But a great,
Interesting.
great guy. Right. That was a big loss to a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah. And he was a very charming person to meet, and he was very
Yeah.
cordial. And he talked to a friend of mine, and I went, and we just sat there and everybody else, they kind of went to hear him sing, and then they left, and I was
Right.
just enthralled just to talk to him because he allowed us to go up and talk to him. So I said, I'm going to talk to him. So
He loves it. He was like the world's oldest graduate student. He just loved to sit and talk about politics and about words. One of his two of his best friends here in Los Angeles, that one of them was in the film, was Emo Phillips, the comedian,
oh, yeah.
and Weird Al. They all got along very well.
Right. I'm going to have to find that at some point. Anyway, excuse me. Well, I can't end the show without you giving a little preview, if you can, of your next book project, which is what got me to pay attention to you in the first place.
Exactly right.
Is Shemp, and we can have you back on the show. We could talk all Shemp, but obviously there's never been an autobiography or a biography of just Shemp.
Right.
So it's a natural for someone to do one. I think Joe Dorita is the only other one, but nobody seems to care. Anyway,
Yeah.
So why Shemp, and is there any information to get out there about him other than what's on film?
Well, I think there's a tremendous story. My literary agent is a guy named Lee Sobel, and Lee and I hit it off. Lee is totally into pop culture and rock and roll and comedians, and he comes up with these ideas. And what do you think of this? What do you think? I don't know if it's for me. Well, this seems like quite an interesting idea. He came up with Shemp. He said, there's never been a book about Shemp Howard. So you go, okay, Shemp Howard, Three Stooges, we get it. But then you look at the story of Shemp Howard, and it is an incredible story of a man with many phobias, many unreasonable fears, a man who was working, with his brother, in the original Stooges, before they were called the Three Stooges. He was one of the original Stooges with Ted Healy. And when it was Mo Howard, it was Larry Fine, and it was Shemp Howard. He did, I believe, one film with Healy,
yeah,
and then left.
Yeah.
Right when they were really about to hit it, he left and went out on his own. And the career that he had over the next 14 years was pretty good. I mean, he was a comic actor who, with a lot more sensitivity than the other Stooges had, a lot more, I think, range, which we'll look into, and a very interesting life. In that when he came out to Hollywood with his wife, with his kids, it was a great story. I mean, he spent 14 years on his own, and only came back to the Stooges when his younger brother had a stroke, when Curly had a stroke, and he came in basically to save the day and fulfill the contract, and wound up staying.
Yeah.
And continued as a Stooge after his death.
Right. There's fake Stooge, the fake Shemp.
Another story.
Yeah.
And then, but it all gets down to, the original title that I had was The Face of Film Comedy, because it's, Frank Sinatra Jr. does a song, that face, that fabulous face. You could put on a wig and be Mo. You can shave your head and go beep, 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 and you can be Curly. You can frizz out your hair and be Larry. But you can't have a face like Shemp. I mean, 1942, I believe it was.
Yeah.
He was voted the ugliest man in Hollywood.
That sounds right.
I have the story. There's a great story. There's the official story of, it was a publicity stunt, of course, but a lot of actresses were involved in it, and people came in when they voted. And he was very proud of being the ugliest man in Hollywood.
Yeah.
But there are artists now, like the one person who is probably more excited about this than anyone is Drew Friedman, the Vermeer of the Catskills, the great. I have a lot of Drew Friedman art here, and Drew is just can't wait to talk about Shemp, because Shemp has been an inspiration to him. I've got some early work. There's one work that Drew Friedman has of a bunch of people on a subway, and there's Wayne Newton, and then there's Joe Franklin, and there's Bob Hope, and there's Shemp in the back.
Yep. We made the cover, Shemp, that his drawing of Shemp, as it were, made the cover of one of his collections of artwork. Yeah, so I mean, any similarity to something, people living or dead, is purely coincidental or something like that. Yeah.
Face.
So well, Shemp is my favorite. That's why I was like attracted to that. Brideless Groom is my favorite Three Stooges short, especially and we're talking about ugly, there's that one scene where his face is mashed against the telephone booth. She goes, and Larry says, who am I getting, the lady asks, who am I getting married to? And he points to him, and it's all mashed in the face, But and it's the cousin Basil part that I love, with Christine McIntyre whacking the crap out of him. So anyway.
But there's great stuff like the Abbott and Costello movies that he did, and Africa Screams, The Bank Dick, and he was in James Stewart's first movie. You probably know that. I think James Stewart was in. It was I don't know if it was an Arbuckle film, but it was one of those films that he made during that period. The research is just beginning on this, but it's going to be and I did a book on Lawrence Tierney. I've got a book we're doing on Marlon Brando. We're coming up to the centenary of Brando's birth and the 20th anniversary of his death. And it's not a biography, but it's a book on the influence that Marlon Brando, the continuing influence that he has on popular culture, from Elvis to the Beatles to, to fashion. The Beatles, going back to that, some people say, and Paul McCartney has said it, the name was inspired by Marlon Brando in the movie The Wild One. Yeah.
Well, they show that clip in the Beatles anthology.
Right. Yeah.
Everybody loves you. The Beatles love you.
The Beatles love you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's we're working on that. And I figured, Lawrence Tierney, Marlon Brando, who else is there but Shemp?
What a combination. Moving up in the world.
The Hollywood Trinity.
Who's next? Gilbert Godfrey. Anyway.
Right. Oh, poor Gilbert. He's terrific.
All right. Well,
by the way, I was going to say, the Stooges were in, if you remember, they were in The Show Won't Go On. The Stooges were in, it was October 21st, 1913. And it was the 6 diving bells in vaudeville. These were 6 young women in bathing suits who would stand around a pool. They would be 30 feet above the ground on a pool on little diving boards. The curtains would open and they would bing and spring into the water. And that's how the show would start. They were backstage. They were ready to go. These diving boards were very, very springy. And if you hit it the wrong part, it'll just launch you up into the air. Poor Gladys Kelly slipped, was launched up, hit her head on the side of the pool, hit the stage, fell 30 feet. They brought her away. She died in the hospital, which left only 5 diving bells for 5 diving women. But actually, there were only 3 diving women, because 2 of the diving bells were Ted Healy and Mo Howard. As teenagers, they were part of this female group.
Interesting.
And so they made the show. They made The Show Won't Go On.
Wow. Very cool. Okay. All right. Well, you have yourself. You need a book about yourself. But anyway, because
I did. I had one already here. It's called.
What is your own book? Let's see.
Tabloid
Baby. No. About your life. That's about your life then, or
that's about my life in television.
I haven't even asked about that. But okay.
It's actually. What is it? It's how to try in television without really succeeding. I think that's how it works.
Okay. I'm gonna have to read that one too. I mean, it's like, wow, now that I know more about you, it's like, oh, I gotta read all this stuff. So anyway. That's
the book that ended my career, in my literary career, before it started. So there you go.
All right. Well, this is the time of the show. It's like the end of the show, and I just have you promote whatever you'd like to promote, how people can get in touch with you, websites, if you're doing any personal appearances, where can they find your books, things like that.
The book is called Lawrence Tierney. This is the galley copy. It'll be a hardcover. Lawrence Tierney, Hollywood's real life tough guy. It is available now for pre-order at Amazon. We'd like to get those pre-orders up there, so people so they can print more copies, knowing that people are interested in it.
Mhm.
We've gotten some really good advanced praise from people in the film noir community and film noir writers and authors, and actually got some quotes from Raquel Vasquez, who was Hollywood's queen of bail. She's the one female bail bondsman, and she said, "I would love to have had Tierney as a customer because yeah, we could get money from him every week."
That's funny.
And LawrenceTierneyBook.com is the website, or BurtKearns.com, but you can find it on Amazon. And if you want to find out how people, one of the nice things about the lockdown, the pandemic, was that for about 2 years, for the most part, people stopped dying on stage.
Hmm.
And that's how we knew that we were into a recovery and that the world was opening up again when the story started again. And so we're keeping track of that at theshowwon'tgoon.com. And if you can't remember that, it's diedonstage.com. I hope to be doing appearances. We're planning to do appearances in probably, in the fall. The book is officially published in November. So it'll be around that time, in the fall, around Christmas time, and then into 2023. But I'll be out there. I'm always out there. And if you're on Facebook, join the Lawrence Tierney group and the Shemp group, right?
Shemp group, yeah.
And I hope we can talk again when the Shemp book is together. We'll have some fun with that for sure.
All right. I know Shemp and Marlon Brando are a big thing on your plate, but anything else you're working on, or no, not at the moment? Or it's too hush under wraps.
I am helping my co-author Jeff Abraham from The Show Won't Go On. Jeff has been working for many years on the first authorized biography of the Ritz brothers.
Oh.
And I'm working with Jeff on that. I'm helping Jeff with that. And we've got there's always things in the pipeline. I'm working on television documentaries. I've been working on a television show here called Who Do You Believe? It's a show on ABC, where they take two sides of a crime or two sides of a story, and both people tell their sides of the story. They have to decide who to believe. I think the episodes I've been working on are airing this month. And, always trying to pay the rent, right?
All right. Well, I want to thank you, Burt Kearns, for being my special guest. Obviously, I'm having my dog infiltrate here at the bottom of the screen.
Very well behaved, yeah.
But anyway, not now.
There you go.
That's
good.
me. Anyway, but it was a pleasure having you on the show, and hope to have you on again when Shemp is ready, or even if Marlon Brando is ready. And we'll talk to you soon.
I look forward to it. Thanks a lot.
All right. And
Cool.
This is Mark Arnold for another episode of Fun Ideas Podcast, and we'll see you next time.